All right, we will go ahead and start our program this morning. I'm going to turn it over to our moderator for this morning's session, Clint Evans, the NRCS State Conservationist in Colorado. So good morning, Clint, the floor is yours.
All right, good morning, Julia. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. We're going to have some great information. Tim Griffiths and Dr. Dave Nago, our science advisor, are going to roll out the Working Lands for Wildlife framework for conservation action with you all here this morning, and we're going to have some Q&A discussion here at the end. But before we get into the presentation, for some opening comments, I have the honor of introducing Mr. Terry Cosby. Mr. Cosby is our acting chief for the USDA-NRCS at the present time. He served the past 16 years as a state conservationist for the USDA-NRCS in the state of Ohio, and he's previously served as our acting regional conservationist as well, prior to serving as our acting chief. So Chief Cosby, I give the floor to you. So thank you.
Hey, Clint, thank you. And it's great to be with you. And I guess someone probably is thinking to themselves that I can't hold a job anywhere. But yeah, I've been all over my 42 years. It's been an interesting ride. So thank you for the invitation. And to Tim and Dr. Dave, just want to shout out to you guys. Great having you on the team. So thank you for your work. And also, Clint, thank you for your work there in Colorado as a state conservationist, very strong state conservationist. And I consider Clint one of my kids, since he did come through Ohio at one time. We had the opportunity to work together for a little bit. And so very happy to see you there in Ohio and doing a great job. But thank you for the opportunity just to share with you for a few moments this afternoon. And as most, and maybe a lot of you don't know, I'm an avid outdoorsman. From my bow hunting to my bird dogs and all the things. And so, you know, I'm just happy to talk with you just a little bit about working lands for wildlife. As I think most of you know, it's the approach that, you know, conserving American working lands, you know, benefits people, wildlife, and rural communities. And that's something that we all, I think, strive for. You know, it targets voluntary conservation, and NRCS is a voluntary conservation agency. We service folks, whether they walk through our doors, whether we knock on their doors, but it is voluntary, incentive-based. You know, a lot of times folks, when they walk in our office, they're not looking for money or incentive. They're looking for that conservation technical assistance, that one-on-one love and care from our agency. And so we're offering that also. And with all of that happening, it improves productivity and wildlife habitat. And I think that's something that you're going to see in the presentations today that we've been working really hard on. And it has to be approached from an ecosystem. We can't do fragmented stuff in this type of landscape. It has to be an ecosystem, and we're glad that approach is being taken. And from that, it helps us focus on wildlife species, and also part of our conservation delivery. It also helps with the health and also make sure we have these functioning ecosystems as we grow these habitats. And we know it's very popular with the landowners. And I'm looking here, 7,400 producers teamed up over 10 million acres. That's phenomenal. And I would just want to give a shout out to the staff that's been working on this, and also the landowners that are part of this. And we can't do any of this without the landowners. They're so important. And so thank you to the landowners for stepping up. 7,400 producers, 10 million acres. That's, like I say, that's just phenomenal. And I want to thank the other federal agencies and state agencies and all the partners that are working with us. And I will tell you that if we can work through a lot of these ecosystems and keep some of these endangered species from being listed, that's great. And I know that, you know, the prairie chicken now, the sage grouse is not on the list anymore. And I think the work that you folks are doing out there in this endeavor is why that's not the case anymore. So continue what you're doing. We want to continue these strong partnerships. We look for this to take over the whole country. not just in the West. We need to be doing this everywhere. And so I think we have a great model. And I say, like I say, I shout out to Tim and Dr. Dave. The model that you folks are developing is something that we can use across this country. So thank you for the opportunity to share with you. And I know that there's going to be some great information that's going to be provided here. And so, Clint, I will kick it back to you and just thank you for the opportunity to be here this afternoon. And by the way, it is afternoon in the East.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Chief. Appreciate your comments and appreciate you giving us some time here this morning to be with the group and talk to our conservation partners. And what you're going to hear from Tim and Dave is they're going to talk about our frameworks for conservation action. And I've got a few comments where I want to stress that the Working Lands for Wildlife is not a program. It's not a financial assistance program. It's a framework for action. Working Lands for Wildlife has now been codified in the 2018 Farm Bill, and it's part of our overall, it's enshrined now in our agency's way of doing business and how we develop planning and landscape scale conservation out here all across the country, and especially in the West, whether it be in the sagebrush biome or in the Great Plains grassland area that we're going to be talking about today. And it's not just a way of doing more, it's about being more effective of how we apply our programs, how we apply our technical assistance, how we build our coalitions of partnerships out here across the landscape to get things done, to help protect our rangelands and things from future conversion. And the two primary threats that we've been able to document over the last 10 years is the threat of woody species encroachment on our rangelands and the threat of conversion to annually crop production. So basically your woodies and your plows are our two biggest threats out there across our grassland landscape. And we're hopeful that through this Working Lands for Wildlife framework for action and these roadmaps that we're developing and the partnerships and collaboration that we're doing all across the country and all across these grassland landscapes, that we'll be able to not only slow down that conversion, but start to turn the tide to send it back the other way so we have healthy, resilient rangelands all across the Western US, because healthy rangelands equals healthy ag production, which equals healthy wildlife habitat. And one of my favorite lines from the Sage Grouse Initiative and those marketing and outreach materials that was developed through numerous partners is what's good for the bird is good for the herd. And so I think what you'll see and hear today from Tim Griffiths and Dave Noggle is you're going to see this healthy or this framework for action that's going to help us keep these rangelands in a healthy, resilient state. We also, I've talked to Tim and Dave and others in the past on other meetings about the state of our grasslands and the concern with drought. And one of the main things I see as I drive around Colorado and get out to meet with partners. Of course, this was pre-COVID, so I haven't been getting out a whole lot lately, but hopefully here later this summer, we'll be able to get out there on the landscape again. But, you know, one of the main things I've seen and heard from producers is a lot of people want to talk about soil health and soil carbon, and those things are important, and they'll be part of this overall framework. We can show improvements in those areas. But really, the one thing that I see is an immediate connection for folks in the livestock industry and those that are managing grasslands. And when you start talking about drought and how drought affects their overall production and resiliency of their ag operation, they can tell you immediately if they're telling you I'm in a D3 drought or how much precip they're low on. They can tell you immediately how that's affected their weaning weights, how it's affected their herd size, how it's affected their numbers of grazing days on their ranches. And so, and when we want to talk about soil health and soil carbon, those are things that we can have deeper dive discussions on, and those are going to be important going in the future, especially with the current administration's emphasis on climate and climate resiliency. Those will all be part of the conversation. But for me, the quickest way that I can connect with an ag producer and talk about rangeland health and healthy rangeland landscapes is we start the conversation talking about drought and how it affects not just the production on their ranch, but the long-term resiliency of their farms and ranches. So Tim and Dave, thank you very much for the opportunity to work with you all and Julia to moderate the session today. I'm going to stop there with my comments, and Tim, I'm going to turn it over to you. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Clint. Thank you, Chief, and good morning to everybody. This is Dave Noggle and I's distinct privilege and honor to have the opportunity today to share with you our new framework for conservation action. These new frameworks are going to enable NRCS as Clint and the chief so eloquently described, make very significant and meaningful contributions to the broader goals of conserving Western rangelands. This work will all be guided by Working Lands for Wildlife, which is our agency's premier approach for focusing those Farm Bill resources, both financial and technical, on threats that are impacting both wildlife and ag sustainability. This outcome-based approach does three things. One, it focuses on those threats that are both impacting wildlife and the production of agriculture. Number two, it's about scale, implementing enough of the right practices in the right landscapes to benefit populations. And lastly, it's our unwavering support to bring in independent scientists to help assess the effectiveness of those applied practices, quantify results, and continually adapt that program and tell the resulting working land story. As Chief had mentioned, across the country, this approach has led to over 7,000 landowners and 10 million acres of conservation. There's been nowhere more popular than in the Western US. Roughly half of those landowners and the vast majority of acres have been conserved through this approach over the last decade, all following this shared vision of achieving wildlife conservation through sustainable agriculture. In the past, these frameworks have been implemented through three initiatives. One is the Sage Grouse Initiative, conserving the sagebrush rangelands of the West. Second is the Western Prairie Chicken, conserving the Southern Great Plains Grasslands. And then we use the Southwest Willow Flycatcher to guide conservation in the desert Southwest. Through the last decade, we've achieved a numerous amount of accomplishments conserving these landscapes through these initiatives, primarily using a single funding source focused in the right landscapes to generate those accomplishments. These new action-based frameworks are going to build on those accomplishments. They are the culmination of a collaborative area-wide planning effort to conserve Western rangelands. Working with our leadership for over a year now, we've crafted an overarching approach, provided emerging technology and spatial data, and led technical sessions. Our NRCS state conservationists, 17 of which, have hosted local strategy sessions with their partners. They've identified the threats they want to focus on, the landscapes they want to work in, and developed acreage goals that they hope to accomplish. The results of this planning effort are all resulted in these new frameworks as an all hands on deck, all program approach for conserving resilient rangelands. And here they are. We finally reached a milestone where we have published and put into these nice color laid out PDF documents, 2 conservation frameworks, one focused on the sagebrush biome, one focused on the Great Plains Grasslands. Overlaid in the center is a map showing how they intersect with the rangeland resources of the country. These frameworks are so much more than a PDF document. They're so much more than a framework that you put on a shelf. They also have a companion online resource. Note the address at the bottom, wlfw.rangelands.app, which provide an incredible amount of supplemental and supporting resources, such as spatial data sets, scientific justifications, technical videos, and more. It's really both the PDF and the online resource that constitute NRCS's new framework for conservation action. So let's take a step back and talk about some of the benefits of this approach, of which there are many. First up is that the bio-level frameworks provide us with a common vision and the coordination necessary to address these resource concerns and ecosystem threats across state boundaries. Harking back to the chief's comments, We have to deal with these threats at an ecosystem scale. Having a biome level perspective enables us to do that. But unlike our previous initiatives that primarily use those individual funding sources, these frameworks maximize the flexibility at that state level for all the local decisions on how and what. It opens up opportunities to use the entirety of the Farm Bill and all of these resources, not only from NRCS, but also those of our partners. It's also important to recognize that these frameworks are not a go-it-alone approach. Instead, they provide us with a mechanism, NRCS, a mechanism to make meaningful contributions to broader goals outlined in other regional strategies. Take, for instance, the sagebrush biome. The sagebrush biome framework that NRCS is releasing today should be considered our agency's contribution to the brand new sagebrush strategy recently released by the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. In similar fashion, there's a massive planning effort underway that spans from Canada to Mexico, where very diverse interest groups are putting together a roadmap for how to conserve central grasslands. You can consider our new Great Plains biome framework for conservation action, NRCS's contribution to this incredible broader effort. A couple major facts that underpin both of these approaches. Number one is the fact that 70% of all land in the western half of our country is comprised of rangeland. Even more, 2/3 of that is privately owned, stewarded through the sustainable production of livestock. To be successful conserving our nation's rangeland, you must have solutions that work for the people that own and operate and steward these lands. This is the sweet spot of which Working Lands for Wildlife capitalizes on. We start with intact rangeland cores. We look for areas that have robust wildlife populations, and equally as important, we have people and communities ready, willing, and able to act. Those are the places that our framework is selecting to make investments in voluntary conservation and move that needle in a very meaningful way. Now I'd like to kick it over to my colleague and our Western Working Lands for Wildlife Science Advisor at the University of Montana, Dr. Dave Noggle.
Thanks, Tim. Incorporating all the latest advances in science and technology places these new frameworks on a solid foundation. The approach focuses on getting ahead of primary threats facing rangelands instead of ambulance chasing to save highly degraded sites with no chance of success. And with the advent of the Rangeland Analysis Platform, framework users now have access to spatial data to inform development of their local strategies. Examples include spatial data across entire biomes that help you track cheatgrass invasion or identify areas of woodland expansion. These data are now linked to frameworks and available online at wlfw.rangelands.app. Next slide. We live in a don't tell me, show me society that constantly questions, how do you know that? So we embedded the scientific rationale behind each framework directly into the documents. Now, anywhere you see a transcript, like the number 1 here on the left, you can click on it to see the title, abstract, and citation of the paper supporting that statement as shown on the right. And if you want to learn more or further judge for yourself, click again on the URL for free access to full documentation. Next slide. Acres enrolled, dollars allocated, and other archaic reporting requirements have been replaced by outcomes as the new gold standard by which the efficacy of Farm Bill investments are judged. Defined by Merriam's dictionary, outcomes are a way a story turns out, a consequence, Common synonyms include the upshot, effect, or a conclusion. Outcomes provide a vital link to effective communications and outreach that help drive producer interest and sustained investment. Working Lands for Wildlife Science team has published 55 outcome-based tools and evaluations since its inception and will continue to help NRCS quantify both ranching and wildlife outcomes. A big shout out to Nebraska NRCS for partnering with Duroc Twidwell at University of Nebraska-Lincoln to bolster our ability to help quantify outcomes across the Great Plains. Back to you, Tim.
Simply put, communication is critical for conservation. As part of this effort, we're also investing to help enhance communications around working rangelands. We want to further align diverse stakeholders around our shared vision of achieving wildlife conservation through sustainable action. For all you partners out there, my pleasure and honor to also introduce you to our new communications director, Miss Julia Debes. Julia, contact information is located on the screen. I encourage you, take a picture of that, give her a call, reach out. We would love to help coordinate communications to your diverse stakeholders as well. Also know that climate benefits of rangeland conservation have been woven throughout the entire frameworks. And from the big picture, rangeland carbon comprises 12% of the world's terrestrial carbon stocks. But like an upside down forest, approximately 90% of that carbon is stored deep away under the surface in the soil profile. The number one climate smart action we can do to store carbon on rangelands is to first and foremost prevent the conversion of grass and shrublands in the first place. And once that work's done, our work should focus on bolstering rangeland resiliency to ensure the land has the ability to adapt to whatever the environment is in the future. That's very important for both people and wildlife alike. Now, instead of going through these frameworks page by page, threat by threat, we'd like to give you a couple of highlights and go into not only some examples of what you're going to find, but also give you some encouragement, if you haven't already done so, to go back to the rangelands.app website, download and become familiar with the frameworks yourself. So let's start with the Great Plains Grasslands. First off, these landscapes are home to some of the world's largest remaining and most intact grasslands. As valued grazing lands, these working lands are the backbone of the U.S. beef industry. In fact, they account for half of all U.S. beef production. This region is also rich in wildlife, including hundreds of migratory bird species, iconic grassland species like the lesser prairie chicken, and it's well known as the Mid-Continent Duck Factory. But all is not well. The Great Plains are also, unfortunately, the world's most imperiled and least conserved ecosystem. One of the primary threats that's facing working lands in this region is the expansion of woody species into grassland habitats. Simply put, when trees move in, grass moves out. This gives you significant negative outcomes for things like forage production from livestock, and unfortunately also direct loss of wildlife habitat. Now, through our partnerships with academic partners at both the University of Montana and University of Nebraska-Lincoln, we now have new technology available that both maps and quantifies this threat in ways we've never been able to see before. The red areas depicted on the map show areas of former grassland that have been lost through woody conversion from 2000 to 2018. Quantification of that threat on the right-hand side and juxtaposed with our known threat of direct cultivation for agriculture tillage reveals that the scale of woody encroachment loss of grasslands is nearly equivalent to that of tillage agriculture. So transforming this knowledge and understanding into on-the-ground outcomes, it requires a sea change in our approach to delivering conservation. So in the past, we would work where the resource concern was readily observed. We would focus in areas that currently had woodland transition or where active expansion was occurring. By doing so, it allowed us to be invaded on our backside, where seeds and seedlings unseen below the grass were causing transitions at scales far greater than what we were conserving through our practices. And unfortunately, that's what's led to the resulting outcomes of this continued conversion of grasslands to woodlands that we just witnessed in the previous slide. The new frameworks, what do they do about it? They flip the script. Instead of working left or right, we start with intact rangeland cores and we vigorously defend those areas. We intentionally reintroduce prescribed fire to that landscape in the dispersal zone, consuming those seeds and seedlings before they have a chance to take over the grassland. And it's this sea change in approach that couples then with doing enough of the right practices in the right places that we seek to achieve the desired benefits. Dave?
Popular in crop science for decades, we're applying yield gap concepts to rangelands to quantify the impact of expanding woody vegetation on productivity of perennial grasses. These analyses are all made possible by the creation of the Rangeland Analysis Platform that maps both expanding tree cover and the productivity of perennial grasses. Shown here on the left is the achievable productivity of perennial grasses, the blue line, compared to the observed productivity with woodland expansion, the red line. The difference, shaded in gray, is yield gap. The right-hand graphic shows severity of yield gap as lost forage potential across both sagebrush and Great Plains biomes. We're finalizing yield gap as an online app for your use in local communities. Let me show you what I mean. Next slide. On the left, in the Flint Hills of Kansas, closing the yield gap created from expanding woodlands, shown here in red, would increase herbaceous productivity by almost 1 billion pounds. That's the amount of grass contained in 798,000 round bales, which if placed end to end would reach all the way from Denver to Kansas City. In producer terms, this represents an $8.4 million increase in available forage annually. Informing producers of these anticipated outcomes is what moves rural communities to grassland conservation at unprecedented scales. Let's move on to marginal soils. Next slide. Retaining grasslands in the Great Plains is paramount to framework success. The most productive soils in the Great Plains have already been cultivated, as shown on the left in red, based on cultivation risk. The right-hand graphic shows previously converted lands in gray, meaning that ongoing conversion in marginal soils is eating away at our last intact grasslands. Reduced crop yields in newly cultivated areas come at high cost to wildlife, water quality, soil health, and carbon storage. Rates of grassland loss, most recently up in the prairie pothole region of the Dakotas and Montana, rival those of forest loss in the Brazilian Amazon. In total, 700 million grassland birds have been lost from this region, making them one of the most imperiled bird groups in the world. Next slide. Now, don't get me wrong, we love the Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP. Since 1985, CRP's incentivized grassland reestablishment, and rural communities have benefited from the $2 billion infusions from set-aside payments. New science in the journal Conservation Biology shows that CRP has helped to conserve 4.5 million grassland songbirds in the southern Great Plains. Still, despite the benefits of CRP, Lark's new work at University of Wisconsin shows we're still losing 1 million acres of grassland annually in the US. And with federal set-aside acreage caps declining, competition is intense to stay in the program. Moreover, Farm Service Agency supported science out of Virginia Tech suggests that more than half of willing landowners surveyed are unable to re-enroll expiring fields. This is concerning because acreage exiting the Conservation Reserve Program is the largest source of grassland loss in the nation. Next slide. So, another novel idea in the Great Plains framework is to help producers transition their expiring CRP to working lands. In one concise sentence, NRCS's approach is to retain grassland exiting CRP by replacing lost annual payments with revenues from livestock grazing. This is not a replacement for CRP, but rather NRCS's opportunity to help willing producers proactively retain their grasslands as a valued asset in their grazing operation. The opportunity is high for widespread adoption. In a new study by Kansas State, grassland retention a decade after CRP contracts had expired is twice as high in lower productivity landscapes where grazing cultures persist. So let's intentionally target those for maintenance of expired contracts. And only 5% of producers that could not renew their CRP contract are enrolled in another program. A little help with water or a grazing system from NRCS and partners could paste back together huge pieces of formerly cultivated landscapes. Next slide. Throughout both frameworks, we use success spotlights to highlight the exemplary work of producers and partners. In this example, we celebrate the continued role of conservation easements and frameworks by calling out Montana's leadership that has perpetually conserved 250,000 acres of grazing lands. To develop conservation at scale, NRCS and partners in Montana built their easement culture from the ground up. This intentional approach included early dialogue with communities to understand their needs, additional investment in people to complete complex real estate transactions, and the combining of diverse funding sources. Together, these easements maintain the longest known sage grouse and pronghorn migrations in North America. Next. As you peruse the frameworks, notice that each threat is accompanied by an anticipated outcome section. The sagebrush framework, for example, encourages continued reduction of expanding woodlands into native rangeland. In these timestamp photos, you can see the slow and insidious expansion of pinyon juniper through time until their removal on public and private lands. In this instance, benefits of early PJ removal include increased resilience to fire, maintenance of grazing land productivity, a documented 12% increase in population growth rate of sage grouse, and a known doubling of sagebrush obligate songbird populations. Next slide. Partnerships are at the heart of both frameworks. Invasion of exotic annual grasses, for example, is a primary threat targeted for the reduction in the sagebrush framework. Other Western states are joining Idaho to defend their state's uninvaded cores from annual grass conversion and to grow the size of those cores by attacking cheatgrass in nearby yellow prioritized areas in the targeting map shown on the right. At the heart of this strategy is knowing that invasive species control is more effective and cost efficient when done early, before infestations become widespread, and when management is informed by what's going on in the larger surrounding landscape. Key strategies include detection and prevention of early invasions and targeted herbicide applications to eliminate or reduce invasive annual grass seed sources. And in recent news, the Western Governors Association, WGA, has adopted this forward-looking defend the core and grow the core strategy for battling cheatgrass and are helping to scale up the crusade across the West. Back to you, Tim.
Central to the frameworks is the goal that Clint mentioned. It's to increase rangeland resiliency, which is most readily recognizable to producers as a synonym for drought and drought resistance. And although each of the threats identified in these frameworks is ultimately linked in some way to this concept, I'd like to give you one example to illustrate how this actually works. Take wet meadows and riparian areas. We know they comprise a very small fraction of the overall rangeland region, yet are outsized in their production of vegetation. And unfortunately, many of these swales and coulees have been degraded over time, resulting in incised channels that act to de-water the floodplain and ultimately remove that sponge effect from the soil. There's several techniques that have been pioneered that use nothing more than sticks and stones that are used to slow the water in those channels, capture the sediment, revegetate, and re-engage the soil in that historic sponge effect. In fact, one very successful partnership in the Gunnison Basin of Colorado is cataloged as one of those success spotlights in the framework. We've used this technique along with others throughout the West to proactively conserve these wet meadows and riparian areas, and have enlisted the help of Nick Silverman at the University of Montana to help us quantify the resulting outcomes of this work. Shown on the bottom left is a chart from his work where he's mapped resiliency over time, years since restoration. Every yellow dot on that map is a single project in a different continuum of time. Some are using beaver dam analogs, some are using Z-dike structures, while others are using grazing systems that all result in this restoration of these degraded meadows. Resiliency, you should think of that as a decoupling from annual precipitation and annual vegetated production. Meaning in the early years of restoration, you had a high correlation between the rain that fell that spring and the grass that you observed that summer. As time went on, that relationship was severed. When that sponge was refilled and resaturated, that forage production, whether it was a wet year or a dry year, was much more consistent and predictable. The variability and the volatility was greatly reduced in the system. That's what he quantified as far as resiliency. So the take-home message here, not only can we be effective, but these projects just continue to get better over time. Lastly, I want to just give you a quick summary of what these frameworks are portraying to do. All told, the two frameworks together have a combined 5-year goal of conserving 11.5 million acres. The sagebrush biome focuses discretely on 4 primary threats: woodland expansion, exotic annual grass invasion, land use conversion, both direct tillage as well as subdivision, and riparian wet meadow degradation. Similarly, the Great Plains framework also focuses on woodland expansion and land use conversion. We plan to track progress annually across both of these biomes and quantify those resulting outcomes, as David identified. But I want to make sure it's really clear that these frameworks are really the big picture vision. This is what we set out to do. This is why we set out to do it. But this is really an olive branch extended to every partner, every landowner group, every conservation group. Help us. Let's find all the different niches, all the different actions that need to happen, and let's combine them to have meaningful outcomes that we can leave these resources in a much better way for future generations than we've received them in. And with that, I want to again give everybody, all of the landowners, all of the partners, all of the NRCS staff, and all of the people that have been involved putting these together, just a huge heartfelt thank you. This is an incredible team effort. It's a very diverse, very inclusive team that's all pooling diverse and very unique resources to make an outcome that none of us could ever do ourselves. I also want to remind folks that the website, wlfw.rangelands.app, is where you can go right now. You can download the frameworks. You'll notice there's also fact sheets. There is GIS data. There is the scientific justification, citations. There's a whole plethora of information. Make sure you touch base with Julia from a communications perspective, and from a local grassroots contact. Make sure you reach out to your local NRCS service center. Get involved in your state technical committees. This is an all hands on deck approach, and we just greatly appreciate the opportunity to share this with you today. And with that, Clint, I'd like to turn it back to you, and hopefully we have some time to take some questions. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Tim. Thank you, Dave. Appreciate your time and all the energy and effort and coordination that you all have put into these frameworks for both the sagebrush biome as well as the Great Plains Grasslands framework. So we've had a couple of questions coming in the chat, and so I'll just start working through those for you. And we'll be running out of time here pretty soon, but I'll try to pick and choose some of the key ones that are going to address the broader audience. So the first question comes from a member of the media, and they said that Tim spoke to the NRCS making significant and meaningful contributions to the broader goals of conserving Western rangelands. Can you provide some specific examples of how that'll be implemented?
So through the Sage Grouse Initiative, I'll give you an example of the Sagebrush West. We have been at that for over a decade, really, again, focusing on some of these key threats, key landscapes. And then we've been bringing our scientists on not only to track the outputs as far as where we're putting these acres on the ground, but quantifying the resulting so what, or the outcomes. And so David mentioned a great example of where we've been working with the BLM and private landowners in the state of Oregon to address this woodland expansion for over a decade. And we've been able to measure now quantified responses in things like sage grouse growth rates, an increase of 12%. Those type of outcomes, we ultimately then rolled up in an outcomes report and provided that to like Fish and Wildlife Service when they were making a listing decision, whether or not sage grouse required listing under ESA. And if you look at the Federal Register, then those goals were incorporated into their decision. And it was cited like 43 different times as evidence for negating that particular decision. So again, that they had broader goals set that we helped contribute to. And so when you look at the WAFWA strategy and they have a new goal to address so many acres of woodland expansion, we now can quantify, here's what we're going to be able to accomplish and provide that to them. Similarly with the Great Plains.
All right, thank you, Tim. The next question is, how does the sagebrush biome framework presented today differ from the Sage Grouse Initiative that has been implemented over the last 10 years?
Yeah, great question. I would say in the Sage Grouse Initiative, from day one to 10th, 11th year of it now, we've really been focused on conserving the majority of that biome. And so I really don't foresee much changes on the ground as far as our approach. It's been, we've been adapting that every year based on lessons learned and so forth. So you can consider that the new sagebrush biome is really NRCS is re-upping our commitment for the next 5 years to continue what we've been doing through SGI, maybe with a few extra bells and whistles.
All right, thank you, Tim. And you spoke to this next question briefly there at the end of your presentation, but the question is, where can ranchers get involved and learn more about best practices to help address these threats? For example, identifying the best native perennial species within their given area.
Yeah, I would say two sources there. Number one, I really do encourage everybody, whether you're an NRCS employee or a partner or a landowner, go download these frameworks. They're 20 pages. They do talk a lot about the knowledge of these threats and what's been tried, what hasn't worked, what has worked, all of those different things. And I think so that would be a really good source to kind of put into context maybe what threat you want to address on your particular place. When you get into the specifics, I don't think there's a better place to go than your local field office. I would say go to your local field office, start there. If you don't already have contacts, make them. And they and their other partners, we have an entire network of other partners that will help you free of charge, develop an individual conservation plan for your operation that meets your goals, meets these broader resource concerns. So that would be exactly where I would go.
All right, thank you, Tim. And speaking of conservation partners, since you just mentioned them in your last response, the next question is, are there unmet capacity needs for getting this work on the ground? And if so, are there mechanisms in place for partners to help?
I would say the answer is unequivocally yes. There is so much work to be done. There's so many landowners. There's so many acres that need to be touched. This really does require an all hands on deck approach. And so one of the things that we've obviously used at NRCS is this hybrid model where we have some staff that are just incredible, conservationists located in practically every county of the country that can provide that one-on-one assistance to producers. But also we have our partners, whether it's, Pheasants Forever or like Utah Department of Ag, conservation districts. And we have a whole number of partners that we've worked with that typically we share positions, right? And those positions are located in our field offices that increase the capacity available to give that one-on-one attention to that private landowner. And we have just a ton of needs for more of that. And so partners, again, I would encourage you start locally with your own state partnership and figure out what are those specific needs and then help fill those. I would point out two big opportunities here. One is with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, or NIFWF, and nationally they've just been a phenomenal partner in going to major corporations and other funding sources and then matching those with government funds to maximize the amount of money that hits the ground. And so we do have a national partnership with NIFWF where they have a RFP that goes out for the Conservation Partners Program. And so if people are interested in helping, get some cost share money to do things like that, I would encourage you to look at that partner. And then two would be, there's a new program in the Farm Bill, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, or RCPP, where partners can also go and apply to get some additional funds to help fill some of these innovative needs that are identified on the ground. And that can be pretty innovative type things that typically are more than just people and can involve a lot of science, on the ground practices and those kind of things. So I encourage you definitely learn about the opportunities through RCPP and also make note that, Great Plains Grasslands are actually one of the identified priorities through that program too. So I think there's outsized opportunity to make good use of that program.
All right, thank you, Tim. I'm going to give you a bit of a break for a moment, and I'm going to throw one here to Dr. Noggle. on the science side. So the question from a producer is, what does the science say about carbon sequestration by trees versus deep-rooted perennial grasses?
Sure. So yeah, get this question a lot. Trees on 6 of 7 continents, excluding Antarctica, are increasing and expanding. We're losing as a result our prairies, intact sagebrush rangelands, and savannas. And so an answer to climate change is not letting prairies be taken over by trees. And so envision the carbon budget in prairies as an upside down forest. Most of the carbon is stored deep in ancient soil pools. And so we need to maintain those deep-rooted perennials so that they can continue to put carbon into the ground. That's our overall strategy. ACOGS is a big piece of the puzzle where it's avoided conversion of grasslands and shrublands. Our easements accomplish that, conservation reserve program, transitioning those expiring fields into working lands. Those are all part of a smart strategy.
All right, thank you, Dave. Tim, gonna switch back to you, and there are a couple of more of the questions on the program side of the house. A question here that says, will this terminate the current grassland CRP program, or will there be more incentives for that in 2021?
Yeah, this in no way, shape, or form, is impactful of what Farm Service Agency and CRP ultimately does. What we're trying to do on the CRP side of it is really look in our toolbox at NRCS and say, for land that ultimately comes out of that program, we're trying just to provide an opportunity to that landowner that's simply trying to make a living, and get some income off of that land. Have you thought about stewarding those resources through livestock? And if so, let us help you with the design, hook you up with some grazing, resources and things like that. And so, yeah, I don't foresee any impact associated with what we're doing in FSA.
All right, thank you, Tim. Yeah, and that was one thing I was going to try to clarify for you as well, is just to reiterate that the CRP program is administered by our sister agency at the USDA, the Farm Service Agency. So we work collaboratively with FSA to implement our programs as well. So just view it as one more tool in the toolbox to address grassland health related resource concerns. All right, the next question, it says, can you elaborate more on what you mean by this isn't a single funding source, but rather a framework? This seems like a departure from my understanding of how Working Lands for Wildlife previously worked, for example, lesser prairie chicken funding pools. How will projects get funded?
That's a beautiful question. Yes. So in the past, Working Lands for Wildlife out west, we talked about sage grouse initiative, lesser prairie chicken initiative, and willow flycatcher. All three of those were really a combination or a blended approach where we had a national funding source coupled with an approach to deliver those resources, right, with the right practices, right places, all of those things. But it really was two things. It was a funding source and an approach. Know that today, none of that changes. So we still have sage grouse initiative. We still have lesser prairie. We still have Southwest willow flycatcher. All of them still have the same resources available nationally. We're still putting them on the ground strategically. No changes. What we've done with this framework, though, is really taken a lot of our lessons learned. And what we learned first and foremost was that one dedicated resource out of like our environmental quality incentives program, although meaningful, was just one arrow in the quiver, right? Because we have a whole host of other Farm Bill resources that we have at our disposal that if we also align those to match that right practice with the right threat in the right place, that is how we could actually get the outcome. And so the other thing to keep in mind is that most of the resources in the Farm Bill are distributed to states and have locally led conservation and technical committees that derive their priorities. And so again, the feedback that we kept getting over the last decade was that most of those decisions on what funding source and practice and so forth are best made locally, but what they lacked was this range-wide or biome-wide framework that allowed that cross-boundary collaboration. And so that's really the niche, right? The sweet spot that these frameworks are providing is that biome level coordination, common vision, common goals, but giving all the flexibility in the world to those state conservationists and their technical committees to figure out how best to use the Farm Bill resources and partner resources. But I think make sure everybody knows, like through sagebrush biome, the funding that comes through Sage Grouse Initiative will still be there and still provide an outsized share of those accomplishments. Lesser prairie chicken, they get $1 million a year, they have, consider that as a down payment in the Southern Great Plains, but I think we'll be able to dwarf those contributions when we leverage these other state and local resources. So I hope that answers that.
All right, thank you, Tim. We got about 3 minutes left and there is 2 or 3 more questions. So I'm just gonna pick one here and then we'll have to close out. So you spoke about outcomes versus outputs. The goal is to impact 11.5 million acres, which is an output. Do the framework documents include the outcomes from impacting those 11.5 million acres?
I'm gonna throw that to Dave.
Yeah, so the anticipated outcomes section, where we have done work in the past, like in the sagebrush system, most of those are known and documented outcomes. In other places where we're still getting revved up in the Great Plains, those are truly anticipated outcomes. With it, and we won't be able to evaluate those outcomes unless all the boots on the ground and producers and these partnerships come together to get the work done. And so the goal is to track those outputs and where they take place, and then come in after the conservation's on the ground and quantify the outcome. And so the Great Plains is unique, right? A lot of sage grouse work has taken place farther west. The Great Plains doesn't sort of have that one iconic species. And so we will ask partners for help in quantifying broadly things like changes in water quantity and quality, improvements in grassland songbirds in some places, further in the northern Great Plains, benefits to waterfowl production, breeding shorebirds, American burying beetles. And so there is a lot of work to be done on outcomes, but the outcomes follow implementation.
All right, well, thank you, Dave. Thank you, Tim. We're just all but out of time. Wanted to let folks know that Julia posted a comment in the chat to let folks know there is 3 or 4 questions that we didn't have time to get to, and the team will be following up to make sure your questions get answered. So thanks again to everyone for joining us today for the rollout of the sagebrush biome and central Great Plains Grasslands frameworks for the Working Lands for Wildlife. We really appreciate you joining us today. Look forward to partnering with private landowners that are on the call, as well as our conservation partners that have worked with us throughout both the Lesser Prairie Chicken Initiative and the Sage Grouse initiatives over the past decade, and look forward to seeing us accomplish additional great resource accomplishments going here through the next 5 years of implementing these frameworks. So thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, and the team will be following up on any unanswered questions. So thank you.